Hello there, U.S. history students. We have a lesson here that has a pretty tragic aspect to it. It really is the story of the moment of divorce, the moment of secession. That's at the climax of this lesson here. And so our targets are, I can begin to understand Abraham Lincoln's political journey. So Lincoln is, in a lot of ways, kind of the central figure, or at least a major figure in the story of the American Civil War. We will meet him today and see where he is at the start of this story. And then we're just going to also witness firsthand how slavery melted down our political system. Again, along the way we're doing our long-term learning target, I can see God's story in the curse of the Civil War. So since the days of Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, the United States, our political system was marked by having two political parties balancing one another out. And political arguments were always sort of filtered through that gauge of having two political parties. And this slavery issue had just gotten so white hot that it melted down political parties by the 1850s. It didn't quite melt down our election system, but it melted down the way people reacted to our election system. And it really was just, everything's pretty much going down. Our system barely survives this particular crisis. If we look at some election results from presidential elections in 1852, what we can see here is that the Democratic Party, the party of Andrew Jackson and James K. Polk and whatnot, was pretty electorally dominant. And they were really in the pole position, the dominant position. They elected a person named Franklin Pierce that year. Franklin Pierce is a real, actual United States president. The old Whig Party, this was their last gasp, and the Whig Party kind of dissolves because, again, the Whig Party and the Democratic Party were both kind of stuck they're in a position of wanting to please everybody with the slavery position and trying to please everyone on the question of slavery effectively will please no one. By 1856, the biggest thing we notice is that the Whig Party is basically gone and a new party has emerged. In red, we have the Republican Party emerging with strength only in the North, but getting, for a brand new party, this Republican Party does pretty well. But the strength is still with the old Democratic Party. They elect a fellow named James Buchanan. Buchanan will become the person widely considered to be the worst president in American history, and we'll learn about why in a few minutes. So we've got the political parties are melting down. The old Whig Party is dissolving. And in the Midwest, in the critical swing state of Illinois, our old friend Stephen A. Douglas is deciding that he's going to run for senator. He wants to win his Senate seat again. And really, for Stephen A. Douglas, in his mind, he's gunning for the presidency in 1860. And he believes that this notion that he has of popular sovereignty can be the way he can kind of thread the needle of the slavery question and win enough nationwide support to become president of the United States in 1860. But if he's going to run for the presidency in 1860, he's got to take care of business and win the Senate seat in 1858. Now, it's probably considered a formality. He is Stephen A. Douglas, after all, a nationally famous figure, and he's running against something called Abraham Lincoln, who is a nominee of something called the Republican Party. So the Republican Party is a brand new thing, a party that's emerging as an anti-slavery party. And Abraham Lincoln is not very well known. He's a pretty obscure figure and definitely considered a long shot at best for the Senate seat in Illinois. Now, we're going to meet and talk about Lincoln a lot, but Lincoln at this stage is a moderate voice. He's a moderate anti-slavery voice, meaning he will argue, he will say that slavery is wrong, but he's also not going to be, he's not a John Brown type, let's put it like that. He's not a burn it all down type. Lincoln is a lawyer. His training is as a lawyer, and he operates as a lawyer. And what he's trying to do in his own lawyerly way is make as clear and as sharp an argument as possible on why slavery is wrong. And he's yet at the same time, like every great politician, and Lincoln is probably our greatest politician in history, he always has an eye on what's possible, right? He's always has an eye on how can I win elections? How can I bring the public along with me? He's not initially successful, but he will have just extraordinary historic level success at the challenge of bringing the public along with him. But he's always, like any politician, any good politician, you're not thinking about how do I lose elections. He's always thinking about how can I win with this issue. So Lincoln is opposed to slavery. He will clearly say as much. But he's not a radical abolitionist, like I said. He's not a radical on the question of equality between blacks and whites. He will talk about how, African Americans have natural rights, but at the same time, he's never going to argue, or at least not at this time, he's not going to argue that African Americans should be the full political and legal equals of whites. He just says it's definitely wrong to enslave any human being. And so as part of your work for this e-learning lesson, you're going to be reading some statements from Lincoln during these debates that he had with Stephen A. Douglas. And I think you'll get an interesting sense of where Lincoln the man is in 1858, a couple years before he will, of course, become president of the United States. So Lincoln and Stephen A. Douglas debate around the state of Illinois. And, these start making nationwide headlines because Stephen A. Douglas is a major figure. But the sense is, Mr. Popular Sovereignty, Stephen A. Douglas is finding a formidable opponent in this figure, Abraham Lincoln. And Republicans in this brand new party are really paying careful attention to Lincoln because he's really sticking it to Stephen A. Douglas in these debates. He's making a sharp, clear, forceful, but moderate argument based on what is legally possible. And also Lincoln's from Illinois. That's a state where if Republicans have any hope to win a national election, they're going to have to win all the northern states and all the Midwestern states. And Illinois is one of those. And so Lincoln's from a swing state, so they're paying attention. And in the end, Abraham Lincoln loses this election between him and Stephen A. Douglas, the Senate race. Stephen A. Douglas wins the re-election for his seat. But it is interesting it's like the shine is off Stephen A. Douglas. This Bleeding Kansas thing had become a debacle. Lincoln had made a name for himself, a national name for himself, in particular among Republican circles. And so these Lincoln-Douglas debates have the effect of elevating Abraham Lincoln and demonstrating that Douglas's moment might have passed. Let's skip ahead a couple years. Now the big stakes, a presidential election after a bad decade, gang. A decade that's seen the mess of the Compromise of 1850, the mess of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Bleeding Kansas debacle, the Dred Scott case, John Brown's raid. This has been a bad decade that we're looking at. And at the back end of it, we see this election that's one of the messier elections in American history. Why is it a mess? It's a mess because we're looking at 4 candidates on the screen right now. That's not a clear choice. The Democratic Party has its convention. In those days, they would all meet together and choose who the nominee will be. And the Democratic Party chooses Stephen A. Douglas. They say, all right, Douglas, with this popular sovereignty approach, maybe, he's nationally known. Maybe he can be the one, like we said, to kind of thread the needle and get enough support in the North and the South. But at this point, Southern Democrats say the problem with Stephen A. Douglas is he's insufficiently pro-slavery, right? Douglas is like, well, I don't know. Who's to say if slavery is good or bad? Let's just put it up for a vote. And Southern Democrats say, we want someone who will make a strongly, stridently pro-slavery argument. John C. Calhoun style. Say slavery is great. And so Southern Democrats get up and leave the Democratic Party convention, break off and form their own party that they call the Southern Democrat Party, and they nominate something called John Breckinridge. And the Republican Party, this brand new party, watches that take place. And they go, okay, here we go. It's like in basketball, right? The Democratic Party is split in two now. And in basketball, the defense got screwed up or mixed up, and now it's like the lane is wide open. All we need to do is not dribble it off our foot, right? Just like dribble it down, 2 dribbles and lay it up. And so how can we pick a nominee that is the most palatable, broadly appealing nominee? And they choose to go with the little-known candidate, Abraham Lincoln, because he's from a swing state. He's a moderate voice. He has a sort of a sensible legal approach to this thing. And they feel like we can sweep the northern states and the Midwestern states with this guy. The other leftover Whigs and some other people put together, create another new party. We're just going to go ahead and ignore that. It's safe to say that when there are 4 parties running, it's going to look like a mess, and it definitely does in the 1860 election. And so what you see is John Breckinridge and the Southern Democratic Party sweep the South. But you look at those numbers, because the southern states don't have as much population, that is not enough electoral college votes. Lincoln and the Republicans sweep the northern states and the Midwestern states and a couple of western states for good measure. Stephen A. Douglas wins New Jersey, I believe. Sorry, Stephen A. Douglas, and Missouri as well. And so the popular vote is a bit messy, but the electoral college vote shows that Abraham Lincoln is our winner. So good news, I guess. What we're looking at from this, if you just start paying careful attention, Lincoln is president of the United States. That's the good news. Mr. Lincoln, you are now president. Here's the bad news. You only got 40% of the popular vote, right? The rest of the country is totally split between these other candidates. In 9 southern states, Abraham Lincoln got 0 votes. Not 0 electoral votes. 0 people in 9 southern states voted for Abraham Lincoln. I mean, you hear people say sometimes, not my president, this person's not my president, and that's a bit of bluster that you can usually ignore. In this case, you can't blame someone in Mississippi or South Carolina for saying, did you vote for Abraham Lincoln? Did you vote for Abraham Lincoln? Did anyone that anyone knows here vote for Abraham Lincoln? This is not our president. What this election doesn't break the country in two, but this election is like, it's like the doctor pronouncing the patient dead, on the operating table. It's like saying, well, I think we're now officially 2 countries. I think that's what this election means. And this is our divorce moment. This is our awful moment. As soon as Lincoln is declared the winner, South Carolina calls for a convention, a big state meeting, and they vote unanimously at this convention to secede from the United States, form a new country, and they say, who's with us? And 6 other states in the deep South, the most kind of slavery-intensive, cotton-producing parts of the South, say, all right, we're with you. And they announce that they have formed a new country called the Confederate States of America. We're no longer part of the United States of America. And James Buchanan, who is still president for a few more months, you remember, there's a couple months between the election and inauguration. James Buchanan does exactly nothing about this. As all these southern states are leaving, James Buchanan says, you're not allowed to do that. But he doesn't use any force. He doesn't even threaten any force. Andrew Jackson, once upon a time when South Carolina threatened to leave, Andrew Jackson, put a gun to South Carolina's head and said, over my dead body. James Buchanan does nothing of the sort. He just kind of rolls over on this. And when you let the country go down in flames on your watch and do nothing about it, then you're going to get tagged with the label of the worst president ever. And I'm sorry, not sorry, James Buchanan, for that. And so we have this awful secession moment. The Deep South, these states in dark red, secede. They announce their secession the moment Lincoln is elected. The Upper South, we see here, says, well, hold on a second. Let us just think. Let's see how Lincoln responds. Let's just keep our heads for a moment and watch what happens. And Abraham Lincoln becomes president at really this awful moment. Everyone's like, what does this mean that these states have left, that they've announced that they've left, that they're a new country? And half of the South seems like they're just waiting for any excuse to jump. And Lincoln becomes president when he is inaugurated. He gives this speech. Now, he's going to give one brilliant speech after the next. In his initial speech, he spends a bunch of time clarifying, saying, guys, Southern states, I am not touching your slaves. At present, I have no constitutional ability to touch your slaves. I am opposed to slavery spreading. I don't want it to get any worse, but I'm not going after your slaves. So he keeps saying that. And he also says, you say that you're seceding. You have no legal right to secede. The Constitution does not give you a right to secede. If you try to secede and try and make a fight over it, we will fight to keep you here. But we're also not going to start any fight. So Lincoln spends all this time saying, I'm not taking your slaves. You don't have a right to leave. I don't want to fight you. I will fight you if you start a fight, but we're not going to start a fight. That's this awful, weird first inaugural address. But then he concludes, not with a legal argument, but with heart language, right? He concludes by saying, we are not enemies, but friends. We must not become enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. And he talks about how we have to look back into our shared past and the founding and find, he calls it the better angels of our nature to help restore in this moment. Well, it doesn't work. And a couple weeks later, Confederate forces opened fire on this little army base called Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter is like a little, it's an army base in South Carolina. And when South Carolina seceded, the U.S. Army soldiers, the United States government soldiers at Fort Sumter say, well, we're staying. And, South Carolina is like, you got to go. We're a new country. And the United States Army says, we're staying. We're not going. And then this battle at Fort Sumter is Confederate forces, as they're calling themselves, South Carolina forces, start opening fire and shooting at them. And the United States starts firing back, and everyone's shooting at each other. And it's this kind of glorious, ecstatic moment of release from the perspective of many Southerners, like at long last, glory, hallelujah, we're fighting against the United States of America. We're fighting against these bloody Northerners who've been at us about slavery forever and ever. Finally, we're going to fight back. Weirdly, this first battle features no casualties. In the morning, the United States Army surrenders the fort, and it's considered a Southern victory. And the Civil War is on. And at that moment, once Fort Sumter happens, these states in orange, the upper South states, say, well, now that it's a fight, we're going to fight alongside our Southern, brothers and sisters, and they join the Confederacy. And that leaves, for the new president, Abraham Lincoln, this very, very tricky situation of what are called the border states, these states in yellow, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. West Virginia is a little different. West Virginia is going to leave the state of Virginia. We'll talk about this. But what these border states are is these are states that have slavery. Not a lot of slavery. It's a small percentage of people are practicing slavery. But slavery is practiced there. But at the same time, the sentiment in those places is we think secession is a really deeply stupid, bad, illegal idea. We don't want to leave the country. But we want to keep practicing slavery, but we don't want to leave the country. That's their basic position. And Abraham Lincoln is like, we have to hold on to these border states. A, because we already lost too many states. B, these border states are along the lines, like they control the Ohio River and all these rivers here. And rivers are highways. And Lincoln says, in order to execute this war, I'm going to need rivers for our transportation network. And so I have to hold on to these border states if we're going to hang on to these rivers. And so Lincoln's like, we have to keep them. And this causes Lincoln to say, I have to, in a sense, bite my tongue a little bit on the slavery question at the start of the war, because it's really important to me that the border states don't bail out and jump in with the rest of the Confederacy. I want to keep them with us. Lincoln's going to have a very tricky balance there, but we'll explore that more next week. In the meantime, we got a Civil War on. Gang, your homework is to look at those Lincoln statements from the Lincoln-Douglas debates and then complete the secession crisis slide in your scrapbook. Thanks for your awesome work today. Have a great day. See you soon.